1430, on the 8th of January, 1945, the war in Europe had distilled itself down to a single, frozen hillside in the Alsace-Lorraine region of France. Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham crouched in knee-deep snow at the base of Hill 616, near Kaisersberg, watching German machine gun fire cut down the winter sky above his pinned platoon. He was 24 years old. He had survived 3 major campaigns, and he had absolutely zero plans to die today. But the tactical reality suggested otherwise. The Germans had positioned 3 MG-42 machine guns in timber emplacements up the snow-covered slope, creating a triangular kill zone that defied survival logic. Each gun was capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound like canvas ripping, a continuous stream of lead that suppressed movement before it could even begin. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must understand the stakes. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was the Colmar Pocket. The German 19th Army was fighting with the desperation of men protecting their own border, just across the Rhine. Dunham's platoon had been advancing through this unforgiving terrain when they walked into a meticulously planned killing box. Machine gun fire raked down from the hilltop, churning the snow into a slush of ice and mud. Artillery shells exploded behind them, cutting off any hope of retreat. The only direction left was straight up a 40-degree slope into converging fields of fire that had been calibrated to the inch. 11 men from 2nd Platoon had already been killed that week. The snow around their position was churned red, a stark and horrifying contrast to the pristine white of the Vosges Mountains. Every soldier in company I knew the statistics. In this campaign, the 3rd Infantry Division, the legendary Rock of the Marne, had lost more men per day than any other American division in Europe. The equation was simple and brutal. The Germans held the high ground. They had clear sight lines. They had stockpiles of ammunition, and they had nowhere else to go. Dunham looked at the hill, his eyes narrowing against the biting wind. His platoon was 35 yards behind him, pressed flat in the snow, unable to move forward or back. The strategic paralysis was total. If they stayed pinned down, German artillery observers would bracket their position, adjust their coordinates, and obliterate them within the hour. If they retreated, they would be cut down in the open, exposed to the grazing fire of the machine guns. The MG-42S had them locked in place, turning brave men into stationary targets. The physical conditions were as deadly as the enemy. The temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow was 18 inches deep, dragging at boots and sapping body heat. Dunham wore standard olive drab wool, which, while worn, made him a dark, high-contrast silhouette against the blinding white landscape. Every other soldier who had tried to move had been spotted, immediately, targeted, and forced back down by bursts of precision fire. The Germans owned that hill. They owned the geometry of the battle. But Russell Dunham was about to change the math. He crawled back to the company position, his mind racing, searching for an advantage in a situation that offered none. He found a white mattress cover, discarded or lost, in the chaos of the advance. To anyone else, it was trash. To Dunham, it was an opportunity. He tore it open and pulled it over his uniform like a robe, fashioning a crude, ghostly camouflage. Then, he started loading. This was not an impulsive act, it was a calculated preparation for a one-man war. He shoved 1, 2, 3 zero-round carbine magazines into every pocket and loop on his uniform. He snagged a dozen Mark II fragmentation grenades onto his belt. He hooked more grenades through his suspenders. He jammed grenades into the buttonholes of his field jacket until the fabric strained. When he finally stood up, he was carrying 72 pounds of ammunition and explosives on top of his rifle. He looked less like a soldier and more like a walking armory wrapped in bed linens. His platoon sergeant looked at him, eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. Dunham didn't explain. There were no words that could justify suicide. He just started crawling up the hill. The first 75 yards took him 18 minutes. This was a game of patience, a lethal game of red light, green light. He moved only during the fleeting moments when German fire shifted to other sectors, or when the gunners paused to swap hot barrels. He pressed himself flat into the drifts when the MG-42S swept back across his approach, the bullets snapping inches above his head. The snow soaked through his mattress cover, freezing against his skin. His hands went numb, the dexterity required to pull a trigger fading with every yard. The rifle sling cut into his shoulder from the crushing weight of the grenades. At 75 yards, he was 10 yards from the first machine gun emplacement. The timber bunker had been reinforced with heavy logs and positioned to give interlocking fire with the other two positions, creating a mutually supporting defense network. 3 Germans manned the gun. 1 fed the ammunition belt, ensuring the weapon never jammed. 1 fired, controlling the devastating output, and 1 scanned for targets, acting as the eyes of the beast. Dunham rose to his feet and charged. It was a primal release of tension. The Germans spotted the movement immediately, a white blur surging out of the snow. The machine gunner swung the heavy barrel toward him at 6 yards, point-blank range for a heavy weapon. The gun opened fire. Rounds tore through Dunham's white robe, snapping the fabric. Then, a rifle bullet caught him. It struck him across the back, carving a 10-inch gash from his left shoulder blade to his spine. The physics of the impact were devastating. It spun him completely around, robbing him of his momentum, and threw him 15 yards back down the hill into the snow. He landed face down. Blood poured from the wound, hot and fast, soaking through the mattress cover and staining the white fabric a shocking, bright red against the snow. The pain was excruciating, a searing line of fire across his back. He could feel the wound pulling open with every breath, the cold air biting into exposed muscle. For 5 seconds, he didn't move. His body screamed at him to stay down, to let the darkness take him. Then a German egg grenade landed in the snow, 2 feet from his head. The fuse was burning. Dunham kicked it away with his boot, a reflex born of pure adrenaline. It exploded 5 yards downslope, close enough that the concussion lifted him off the ground, rattling his teeth and blurring his vision. And then, the impossible happened. Russell Dunham got back on his feet. He didn't just stand, he attacked. He came up the hill firing, ignoring the blood running down his back, ignoring the shock. His M1 carbine was still loaded with 28 rounds. The German machine gunner, likely stunned that the American was still moving, swung the MG-42 back toward him, but Dunham was already inside the gun's minimum traverse arc. He was too close for them to track him effectively. At 4 yards, looking into the eyes of the enemy, he fired a 3-round burst into the gunner's chest. The assistant gunner reached for his rifle, desperate to stop the assault. Dunham shot him twice. Both Germans dropped. The 3rd crew member, the ammunition feeder, threw his hands up and started shouting in German, his will to fight vaporized by the violence of Dunham's counterattack. Dunham's carbine was empty. 30 rounds gone in 18 seconds. He slung the rifle, grabbed the German by the collar of his Feldgrau coat, and hauled him out of the timber emplacement like a rag doll. Then, he shoved him down the hill toward the American lines. The German half ran, half fell through the snow, terrified. Dunham's platoon would take him for interrogation. Blood was running down Dunham's back in steady streams now. The bullet wound had torn through muscle and tissue, but missed his spine by less than 2 inches. Every movement pulled the gash wider, threatening to incapacitate him. The white mattress cover was soaked red from his shoulders to his waist. Against the snow, he looked like a bloody flag, a beacon of violence. The 2nd machine gun position was 50 yards uphill and to the right. The Germans manning that gun had watched Dunham take out the first nest. They knew he was coming. The element of surprise was gone. They had adjusted their field of fire to cover the approach, narrowing their focus to the single man destroying their defense. Dunham could see the timber logs of their emplacement and the dark, menacing shape of the barrel tracking across the slope. He reloaded the carbine with a fresh 30-round magazine. 11 magazines left, 10 grenades remaining. He started moving. The Germans opened fire at 40 yards. Rounds snapped past his head and kicked up geysers of snow around his boots. The suppression was intense. Dunham went down and crawled. The pain in his back was so intense, he had to stop every few yards to keep from blacking out. He could feel blood pooling inside his uniform, warm and sticky, before rapidly cooling against his skin. His hands were shaking from blood loss in the bitter cold, but he kept crawling, dragging his body up the slope. At 25 yards from the 2nd emplacement, he rose to one knee. This was the moment of truth. He pulled 2 Mark II grenades from his belt. He yanked both pins, counted 2 seconds, cooking the fuses to ensure they couldn't be thrown back, and hurled them in a high arc toward the timber bunker. The Germans saw them coming. One of them screamed, a sound cut short by physics. Both grenades detonated inside the emplacement within half a second of each other. The combined blast was catastrophic. It threw logs and equipment out of the position, shattering the timber defenses. The machine gun went silent. Dunham moved forward, carbine raised, stepping through the debris. Smoke poured from the shattered emplacement, acrid and thick. He could see body parts in the snow. The entire three-man crew had been killed by the grenades. He didn't stop to celebrate. He turned his attention downslope to the supporting riflemen who had been dug into foxholes around the machine gun position to protect its flanks. 6 German infantrymen were scrambling out of their holes, their morale broken, trying to get clear of the madmen on the hill. Dunham fired into them from 15 yards. He went through another full magazine, shooting at every shape that moved, methodically clearing the zone. He hit 3. The others broke and ran up the hill, retreating away from the American advance. Dunham let them go. He had a bigger problem. He had 1 target left. The 3rd machine gun was 65 yards further up the slope. It was the highest position, the command nest, the one with the best field of fire over the entire American advance. The Germans there had been watching Dunham's assault for the last 12 minutes. They knew exactly where he was. They knew he was wounded. They knew his white coat was now blood red and perfectly visible against the snow from 200 yards. And they had him in their sights. Dunham looked up the hill. The barrel of the MG-42 was aimed directly at him. Rifle grenades started exploding in the snow 10 yards from his position, searching for his range. The concussions knocked him sideways, rattling his brain inside his skull. He hit the ground as machine gun fire tore through the air where he had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. He was out in the open, no cover. The blood trail behind him in the snow looked like a road map for the enemy gunners. And the Germans on top of the hill weren't going to miss again. Dunham crawled. He had to. Walking meant death. The 3rd machine gun position was dug into a cluster of timber 40 yards ahead and 30 feet higher in elevation. The Germans had reinforced it with sandbags and positioned it to cover the entire southern approach to Hill 616. Every few seconds, the MG-42 would fire a burst, walking rounds across the snow, searching for him, probing the depressions in the terrain. He moved during the gaps between bursts. 5 yards. Stop. Wait for the gun to traverse. 3 more yards. The snow was so cold, it burned his hands like fire. The wound in his back had gone from sharp pain to a deep, grinding ache that radiated through his entire torso, threatening to overwhelm his nervous system. He had lost enough blood that his vision was starting to tunnel at the edges, the world narrowing to the enemy bunker. But he still had 9 magazines and 8 grenades. At 40 yards from the 3rd position, a rifle grenade exploded 6 yards to his left. The blast threw snow and frozen dirt across his back, and the impact from the shrapnel felt like being kicked by a horse. He didn't know if he had been hit again. He couldn't tell anymore. Everything hurt. His body was a map of trauma. He kept crawling. 30 yards. 25. The machine gun fire was getting more accurate. The Germans could see him now, even against the snow. The blood had soaked through the entire mattress cover. He was leaving a red trail that pointed directly to his position like an arrow. 20 yards. 15. At 15 yards, Dunham stopped crawling and gathered his legs under him. He had to time this perfectly. The MG-42 fired in bursts of 8 to 12 rounds, then paused for 2 to 3 seconds while the gunner readjusted his aim, or the barrel cooled slightly. Dunham counted. Burst. 1, 2, 3. He lunged to his feet and staggered forward, summoning the last reserves of his strength. The Germans saw him immediately. The machine gunner swung the barrel, desperate to bring the weapon to bear. But Dunham was already moving, already pulling grenades from his belt. He had 2 Mark 2 seconds in his hands. Pins pulled. At 10 yards, he threw them both with a precision born of desperation. The first grenade hit the sandbags and bounced into the emplacement. The second went through the narrow firing slit, 1,000,000 to 1 shot. Dunham dived flat as both grenades detonated. The blast was massive. Sandbags flew apart, disintegrating into dust. Timber logs cracked and splintered. The machine gun barrel was blown sideways off its mount, twisted metal smoking in the cold air. Dunham pushed himself up, his ears ringing. Smoke poured from the shattered position. He moved forward with his carbine raised, scanning for movement. All 3 crew members were down. One was still moving, trying to reach for a rifle with shattered limbs. Dunham shot him once. The German stopped moving. Then he heard boots crunching in snow behind him. The sound was distinct, close. Dunham spun around. A German rifleman had come up from one of the support foxholes, maybe 20 feet away, trying to flank him. The German raised his Carabiner 98 rifle and fired at point-blank range. The bullet missed Dunham's head by 3 inches, the crack of the supersonic round deafening. Dunham fired back instantly. His first round hit the German in the throat. His second hit center mass. The German fell backward into the snow and didn't move. Dunham stood on the hilltop, breathing hard, the steam from his breath mixing with the smoke of battle. His carbine was empty again. He had fired 175 rounds. He had thrown 11 grenades. 3 machine gun positions were destroyed. 9 Germans were dead. 7 more were wounded. 2 had been taken prisoner, and his platoon was no longer pinned down. Below him, he could see Company I advancing up the slope, a wave of olive drab moving freely for the first time in hours. His brother Ralph was among them, moving with 2nd Squad. The Germans were falling back to secondary positions further up the ridge, their defensive line shattered by 1 man. The attack was succeeding. Hill 616 would be in American hands by nightfall. Dunham looked down at his uniform. The white mattress cover was completely red now, saturated with blood from the neck down to his knees. He could feel the wound in his back pulling apart with every breath. The pain was so intense, he couldn't think straight. His hands were shaking uncontrollably from shock and blood loss, but he had done it. 120 soldiers from Company I had been pinned in that valley. Without his assault, they would have been slaughtered by artillery within the hour. Now they were moving. Now they were fighting. Now they had a chance. Dunham sat down in the snow and waited for the medics to reach him. He didn't think he was going to die. Not today. He had refused permission for death to take him on that slope. The medics reached Dunham 8 minutes after he sat down. They cut away the blood-soaked mattress cover and opened his field jacket to assess the wound. The sight was grim. The bullet had carved a gash 10 inches long and 2 inches deep across his back, running from his left shoulder blade down toward his spine. The medics could see muscle tissue and exposed bone. They packed the wound with sulfa powder, the standard battlefield antibiotic, and wrapped it tightly with compression bandages to stem the bleeding. Then they gave him a shot of morphine and tagged him for evacuation. Dunham refused to leave. He stood up, swaying, and walked back down the hill with Company 1, carrying his empty carbine. By the time they reached the battalion aid station at 1,800 hours, the adrenaline had faded, and the reality of blood loss took over. He collapsed at the entrance. The battalion surgeon examined him and immediately ordered him to the rear for surgery. The wound needed stitches, debridement, and at least 2 weeks of recovery before he could even consider returning to combat operations. Dunham spent 4 days at the division clearing station. The surgeons cleaned the wound and closed it with 43 stitches. They told him the bullet had missed his spinal cord by less than 2 inches. If the angle had been slightly different, he would have been paralyzed from the waist down. If the gash had been 1 inch deeper, it would have severed his spine completely. But the wound was clean. No major nerve damage, no infection yet. He would heal. On January 13th, just 5 days after the assault on Hill 616, Dunham was released from the clearing station and sent to a rest area 20 miles behind the front lines. The 3rd Infantry Division had been fighting continuously since landing in southern France in August 1944. The division had pushed through the Vosges Mountains, fought through Strasbourg, and was now engaged in Operation Nordwind, the last major German offensive on the Western Front. The casualties had been catastrophic. In December alone, the division had lost 863 men killed and 3,200 wounded. Every rifle company was operating at 60% strength. The replacement pipeline couldn't keep up with the losses. Men were being pushed back into combat before their wounds fully healed, because there was nobody else to fill the line. Dunham's wound was still seeping through the bandages. The stitches pulled every time he moved. The doctors had told him he needed 3 more weeks of recovery before returning to duty. But on January 18th, 10 days after Hill 616, he walked into the Company I command post and reported for duty. His wound wasn't healed. The stitches were still in. But 2nd Platoon was down to 18 men, and they needed every rifle they could get. The company commander looked at Dunham's medical file, looked at Dunham, and assigned him back to his squad. No questions asked. They were moving north to Holzweier, a small town 15 miles from the German border. Intelligence reported heavy German armor in the area. Panzer units from the 19th Army were conducting spoiling attacks to delay the American advance. Company I would be holding a defensive position on the southern edge of town. Dunham rejoined his platoon on January 20th. His brother Ralph was still with 2nd Squad, still carrying the same Browning automatic rifle he'd used since North Africa. They didn't talk about Hill 616. There was nothing to say. Everyone in the company knew what had happened. General Patch himself had visited the battalion on January 16th and asked to meet Dunham. The general had shaken his hand and said his actions had saved the lives of 120 men who would have been killed by artillery if the machine guns hadn't been eliminated. But that was Hill 616. This was Holzweiler. Different fight, different stakes, exhausted, under strength, and facing German armor with limited anti-tank support. Every position they held was temporary. Every defensive line was one breakthrough away from collapse. And on the morning of the 22nd of January 1945, 2nd Platoon would find itself surrounded by German tanks with nowhere to run. Dunham's war was about to get significantly worse. At 0600 on the 22nd of January 1945, German tanks appeared on three sides of Company I's position in Holzweiler. Dunham counted 7 Panther tanks and 3 Tiger Is, moving through the morning fog, their engines growling like rolling thunder across the frozen fields. The 3rd Infantry Division had no armor support in this sector. No tank destroyers, no artillery within range. 2nd Platoon had 2 bazooka teams, and exactly 14 rockets between them. The German attack came from the 19th Army's Armored Reserve. Units that had been held back during Operation Nordwind and were now being committed to cut off the American salient pushing toward the Rhine. The Panthers came in from the west, advancing in a staggered line across the open farmland. The Tigers moved up from the south, their 88mm guns already traversing to engage any targets that showed movement. Company I's position was indefensible. They held a cluster of farm buildings on the southern edge of Holtzweiler with no cover, no concealment, and no way to stop 7-ton tanks with frontal armor 8 inches thick. The bazooka teams fired their rockets at maximum range. 2 hit. Both bounced off the Panther's glacis plate without penetrating, spiraling away harmlessly. The Germans didn't even slow down. At 0630, the company commander gave the order to surrender. It was the only logical choice to prevent a massacre. White flags went up from 3 buildings. The German tanks stopped advancing, and infantry moved forward to take prisoners. 147 men from Company I walked out with their hands up. The Germans disarmed them, searched them, and formed them into columns for transport to POW camps in the rear. Dunham didn't surrender. He slipped out the back of the farmhouse while the Germans were processing prisoners and ran west through a line of bare trees toward a cluster of outbuildings 200 yards away. His back wound had reopened during the night. He could feel blood seeping through the bandages under his uniform, a warm reminder of his mortality. But he wasn't going to spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp. He reached the outbuildings without being spotted. There were 3 structures: a small barn, a tool shed, and a stone storage building with a wooden door hanging off its hinges. Dunham checked the barn first. Empty, except for rotting hay. The shed had nothing but broken farm equipment. The storage building had barrels. 6 wooden barrels stood against the far wall, each one about 4 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter. Dunham lifted the lid off the first barrel. Potatoes, frozen solid. Second barrel, empty. Third barrel, sauerkraut. The fermented cabbage filled the barrel to within 6 inches of the top, and the smell hit him like a physical force. It was overwhelming, acidic, strong enough to water his eyes and burn his nostrils. Dunham looked back toward the farmhouse. German soldiers were moving through the area now, checking buildings, searching for stragglers. He could hear voices shouting in German, boots crunching on frozen ground. They'd be here in minutes. He climbed into the sauerkraut barrel. The cabbage was cold and slimy, and packed tight enough that he had to force his way down into it. He sank up to his chest, then his neck, then pulled the wooden lid over his head, and settled into the fermented mass. The sensation was horrific. The smell was suffocating, filling his lungs with the stench of rotting vinegar. But worse was the pain. The brine soaked through his uniform and into the open wound on his back. The sting was excruciating, like acid poured directly into raw tissue. It felt as if his back was on fire. He bit down on his tongue to keep from screaming, tasting his own blood. He could hear the Germans entering the storage building. Boots on stone floor. Voices discussing something in rapid German. The sound of barrels being kicked. Lids being lifted. They were checking every container. Dunham held his breath and pressed himself deeper into the sauerkraut, praying the slime would cover him completely. The lid above him stayed closed. The Germans moved through the building, checked the other barrels, and left. Dunham stayed in the barrel. He didn't move. he barely breathed. The temperature was dropping, night was coming, and he had no idea if the Germans would be back. Dunham spent 13 hours in the sauerkraut barrel. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit after sunset. The brine froze into slush around his body, locking him in a vice of icy fermentation. He couldn't feel his hands or feet. The wound on his back had gone numb from the cold and the acidic burn of the fermented cabbage. Every hour, he would shift his weight slightly to keep blood flowing, but the movement sent fresh waves of brine into the gash across his spine, reawakening the agony. At 0700 on January 23rd, the sun came up. Dunham could see thin strips of light through gaps in the wooden barrel lid. He listened. No voices, no engine noise, no boots on frozen ground. The Germans had moved on. He waited another 30 minutes to be certain caution was the only thing keeping him alive, then slowly pushed the lid off and climbed out of the barrel. His uniform was soaked through with sauerkraut brine and frozen stiff. His fingers were white from frostbite. The bandages on his back had dissolved completely, leaving the wound exposed. He could smell the sauerkraut on himself from 10 feet away, but he was alive and he was free. He moved to the door of the storage building and looked out. The farmyard was empty. The German tanks had pulled back during the night. Company I's position was abandoned. Except for equipment, the Germans hadn't bothered to collect. Dunham could see American helmets and rifles scattered in the dirt. He needed to move. He needed to get back to American lines before the Germans returned. But first, the basic needs of the body intervened. 13 hours in a barrel without moving had left him in agony. He stepped out of the storage building, moved around the corner to the side of the barn, and relieved himself against the stone wall. That's when the 2 German soldiers appeared. They came around the opposite corner of the barn at a walking pace, talking to each other in low voices. They saw Dunham immediately. Both raised their rifles and started shouting in German. Dunham froze. He raised his hands. He had no weapon visible. His carbine was still in the sauerkraut barrel. He was soaking wet, covered in fermented cabbage, and obviously unarmed. The Germans approached carefully. The first soldier kept his rifle trained on Dunham, while the second moved forward to search him. The German patted down his field jacket, checking pockets. He found a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes in Dunham's left breast pocket and held them up. The other German lowered his rifle slightly, eyes fixed on the cigarettes. In 1945, American tobacco was a currency more valuable than gold on the front lines. Both soldiers started arguing, presumably about who would keep the pack. Neither one finished searching Dunham. Neither one checked his right side. Neither one noticed the Colt M1911 pistol in a leather shoulder holster tucked under his right arm beneath his field jacket. The Germans finally agreed to share the cigarettes. They marched him back to the main road where a German Kübelwagen, the Wehrmacht equivalent of a jeep, sat idling, its driver waiting behind the wheel. The 2 soldiers pushed Dunham into the back seat and climbed in on either side of him. The driver put the vehicle in gear and headed east toward German lines. Dunham sat between his captors, hands on his knees, and said nothing. They drove for 40 minutes through frozen farmland and small villages. At 1,100 hours, the driver pulled off the main road and stopped in front of a stone chateau that had been converted into a German command post. The driver said something in German and climbed out of the vehicle. He walked toward the chateau entrance and disappeared inside, leaving the engine running. The guard on Dunham's left lit one of the Lucky Strikes, inhaling deeply, and stared out the window. The guard on his right leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. They had grown complacent. They assumed the broken, smelly American was defeated. Neither one was watching Dunham anymore. He reached under his jacket, pulled the Colt from its holster, turned to his right, and shot the guard in the head at point-blank range. The sound was deafening inside the canvas-topped vehicle. The guard on his left started to turn, eyes wide with shock. Dunham shot him twice in the chest. Then, he kicked open the door, jumped out of the Kübelwagen, and ran for the tree line 300 yards to the north. Dunham ran like a man possessed. Behind him, he heard shouting from the chateau, then the crack of gunfire. Bullets snapped past his head and kicked up frozen dirt at his feet. He didn't look back. He reached the tree line and kept running, crashing through bare branches and frozen underbrush. The Germans fired for another 30 seconds, then stopped. They weren't pursuing. They had prisoners to guard and a command post to secure. One escaped American wasn't worth a squad-level manhunt in the freezing cold. But Dunham was alone in German-held territory with no map, no compass, no food, and a pistol with 4 rounds remaining. The wound on his back had reopened during the run. He could feel blood soaking through his uniform again. His feet were already numb from frostbite after 13 hours in the sauerkraut barrel. The temperature was 9 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. He was 30 miles behind enemy lines, with no clear route back to American positions. He moved west. That was the only direction that made sense. West toward the front. West toward the sound of artillery. West toward anything that wasn't German. He walked through the afternoon, staying in tree lines and ditches, avoiding roads and villages. Every 20 minutes, he had to stop and force his frozen feet to keep moving. The pain in his back was constant now, a grinding ache that radiated through his entire torso with every step. At nightfall, he found a destroyed barn and crawled into what remained of the hayloft. He couldn't risk a fire. The Germans had patrols everywhere. He pulled dried hay over himself for insulation and tried to sleep. The temperature dropped to 3 degrees Fahrenheit. His uniform was still damp from the sauerkraut brine. The moisture froze solid against his skin. He shivered so violently that his teeth cracked together and cut his tongue. On the second day, he kept moving west. He crossed frozen fields and empty roads. He saw German vehicles twice and hid both times until they passed. His feet had gone from numb to burning agony, a sure sign of severe tissue damage. When he pulled off his boots that night to check them, he saw that his toes had turned black. 2nd degree frostbite, possibly 3rd. He put his boots back on and kept walking. If he stopped moving, he would freeze to death. On the 3rd day, January 25th, he heard American artillery. The sound came from the west, a steady rumble of 155mm howitzers firing in battery. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He followed the noise. By mid-afternoon, he could see smoke from American positions rising above the tree line. He was close, maybe 5 miles, maybe less. At 1,600 hours, Dunham emerged from a stand of trees and saw the Ill River. A steel bridge crossed the water, and on the far side, American engineers were working to reinforce the structure with timber supports. Dunham started walking toward them. The engineers saw him coming and raised their rifles. He was wearing a German-issue field jacket he'd taken from a destroyed supply truck the previous day to replace his frozen coat. He looked like the enemy. Dunham raised his hands and shouted that he was American. The engineers kept their rifles trained on him. He shouted his name, his rank, his unit. One of the engineers lowered his weapon and waved him forward. Dunham crossed the bridge, barely able to walk now. His feet were destroyed. His back was infected. He had lost 20 pounds in 3 days. He collapsed at the far end of the bridge. A medic appeared. Dunham recognized him, Corporal Henderson, from the battalion aid station. Henderson looked at Dunham's feet, looked at the festering wound on his back, and immediately called for a stretcher. They loaded Dunham onto a truck and drove him to the division clearing station. The surgeons there worked for 6 hours to save his feet from amputation. They cleaned the infected wound on his back and started him on sulfa drugs to fight the massive infection. 3 days later, while Dunham was recovering in a hospital bed, a lieutenant from division headquarters walked into the ward. He told Dunham that his company commander had submitted a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross. But the regimental commander had changed it, and the division commander had approved the change. Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham was being awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on Hill 616. On April 23, 1945, Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham stood at attention in Zeppelin Stadium in Nuremberg, Germany. The stadium had been the site of Nazi Party rallies before the war, a place where Hitler had preached hatred to hundreds of thousands. Now it was rubble and broken concrete, occupied by American forces. The symbolism was potent. Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commander of the 7th Army, stood before him holding the Medal of Honor. Patch read the citation aloud. The crawl uphill 616, the 3 machine gun nests, the 10-inch wound, the German grenade kicked aside, 9 enemies killed, 7 wounded, 2 captured, 175 rounds of carbine ammunition, 11 grenades expended, and 120 American soldiers saved from certain death. Then, Patch placed the medal around Dunham's neck and said something that wasn't in the official citation. He said that in 30 years of military service, he had never seen a single soldier turn the tide of an entire engagement through sheer courage and refusal to stop. He said that Russell Dunham had fought like 10 men that day, and every man who walked off Hill 616 alive owed his life to one sergeant with a mattress cover and a dozen grenades. Dunham stood silent. His brother Ralph was in the audience, along with 40 men from Company I who had survived the Alsace campaign. The war in Europe would end in 2 weeks. The 3rd Infantry Division had fought from North Africa to Sicily, to Italy, to France, to Germany. They had lost 11,300 men killed and wounded. They had earned 36 medals of honor, more than any other division in the war. But on that day in Nuremberg, only Russell Dunham stood on the platform. The medics had saved his feet. The infection in his back wound had cleared after 3 weeks of sulfa treatment. The stitches had come out. The wound had healed into a thick scar that ran 10 inches across his spine. He would carry shrapnel in his bag for the rest of his life, small fragments too deep to remove without risking paralysis. After the ceremony, Dunham returned to the United States. He was 25 years old. He had enlisted in August 1940 with his brother Ralph because work was scarce during the Depression, and the Army paid $30 a month. He had survived 4 amphibious landings, 7 major campaigns, and 2 escape attempts from German capture. He had killed at least 19 enemy soldiers that could be confirmed. He had been wounded 3 times. He went home to Illinois. He married a woman named Mary and worked as a benefits counselor for the Veterans Administration in Street Louis for 32 years. He helped returning veterans navigate the system, file claims, and access medical care. He attended Medal of Honor conventions and reunions with the 3rd Infantry Division. He never talked much about the war unless someone asked directly. And when they did, he always said the same thing. He said he was just doing his job. He said any man in company, I would have done the same. Russell Dunham died in his sleep on April 6, 2009, at his home in Godfrey, Illinois. He was 89 years old. His brother Ralph had died 10 years earlier. Most of the men from Company I were gone. The war that had consumed their youth was now ancient history to most Americans. But the Medal of Honor citation remained. The official record remained. And 120 men who should have died on Hill 616 inches January 1945 had lived instead. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about sergeants who saved lives with mattress covers and grenades. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Russell Dunham doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered. And you're helping make that happen.